The morning briefing at FOB Gibraltar should have been routine. Commander Jake "Reaper" Morrison stood before a wall of tactical displays, red dots marking hostile positions across the Syrian border. 36 hours earlier, Bravo team had gone dark during a high-value target extraction. No radio contact, no distress beacon, just silence stretching across 40 miles of enemy territory. "Intel confirms clear skies," Morrison announced to the assembled SEALs. "No air support available, no overwatch, you're going in naked." The operators shifted in their chairs, faces stone-cold beneath tactical beards. They'd done worse with less, but something felt wrong about this one. Staff Sergeant Louis Prophet Vega raised his weathered hand. "Sir, what about that F-22 squadron from Incirlik?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Redeployed yesterday. Like I said, no air support." The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and distant helicopter rotors. These men had learned to trust their instincts, and every instinct screamed danger. What Morrison didn't tell them was that 3 reconnaissance drones had vanished over the same grid square. What he couldn't tell them was that satellite imagery showed something impossible, thermal signatures that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. What he wouldn't tell them was that his superiors had already written off Bravo team as KIA. 12 hours later, Alpha team infiltrated under moonless skies. The landscape stretched before them like a moonscape of broken concrete and twisted metal. Prophet's night vision painted everything in ghostly green as they moved through the ruins of what had once been a village. Their target, a compound where intelligence suggested Bravo team was being held. "Overwatch, this is Alpha 1, Prophet whispered into his throat mic. "Moving to checkpoint Bravo." Static answered him. The communication blackout was total. They were beyond the reach of friendly forces, operating in a dead zone where even satellites feared to linger. The compound appeared ahead, a cluster of reinforced buildings surrounded by concrete walls. Too quiet. No guards visible. No movement in the windows. Prophet felt ice in his veins as he signaled his team to spread out. Through his scope, he could see scorch marks on the buildings, deep gouges in the concrete that looked almost like claw marks. "Something's wrong," muttered Corporal Dice Martinez, his voice barely audible through the comm. "Where is everybody?" That's when they heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist in this place. The distant whistle of jet engines, impossibly high, impossibly fast. Prophet looked up through his night vision and saw nothing but empty sky. But empty skies, as they would soon learn, could be the most dangerous places of all. Somewhere above them, beyond the reach of radar and thermal imaging, something was watching. Something that had been waiting for exactly this moment, for exactly these men, in exactly this place. The morning briefing had been wrong about many things, but the sky wasn't empty. It never had been. High above the broken landscape of Syria, beyond the ceiling of conventional aircraft, a lone F-22 Raptor hung like a predator in the darkness. Its pilot had been monitoring radio chatter for the past 18 hours, waiting for the right moment to break every rule of engagement ever written. Captain Nix, Valkyrie Castellanos, had earned her call sign the hard way, by pulling the dead and dying from burning aircraft across 3 tours of duty. Her hands, steady on the stick despite the turbulence at 40,000 feet, bore the scars of that reputation. But tonight, those hands would write a different kind of legend. The official record would show that no U.S. aircraft operated in Syrian airspace that night. The mission files would be classified at levels that didn't officially exist. But the men on the ground were about to witness something that would redefine their understanding of air superiority. Nix's HUD displayed the thermal signatures of Alpha Team as they approached the compound. 7 men, moving with the practiced precision of elite operators, unaware they were walking into a trap that had been set specifically for them. Below, in the compound's basement, the surviving members of Bravo Team were bound and beaten, their execution scheduled for dawn, a propaganda video that would broadcast American failure to the world. "Command, this is Valkyrie," she whispered into her oxygen mask, knowing no one would answer. Requesting permission to engage. Static filled her headset. She was operating under radio silence, in airspace that officially didn't exist, flying a mission that had never been authorized. But sometimes the right thing to do and the authorized thing to do were separated by an impossible gulf. Sometimes a pilot had to choose between following orders and following her oath to leave no one behind. Nix had made that choice the moment she diverted from her reconnaissance mission 12 hours earlier. Her father, a Vietnam-era Phantom pilot, had once told her that the sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it. Tonight, she would claim it all. The compound below was crawling with hostiles, 30-plus fighters who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They had surface-to-air missiles, radar installations, and enough firepower to turn the surrounding desert into a killing field. What they didn't have was experience fighting a ghost. Nix dropped the Raptor's throttle and began her descent, the aircraft's stealth profile rendering it invisible to the sophisticated air defense systems below. Her targeting computer began painting targets with surgical precision: guard towers, weapon emplacements, communications equipment. Each target represented a life she would take, a decision she would carry forever. But in the basement of that compound, 7 Americans were counting on her to make those decisions. 7 Americans who had volunteered to walk into hell for their country, who deserved better than to die as propaganda pawns in a war that seemed to have no end. The transformation from reconnaissance pilot to angel of death took less than 30 seconds. Prophet felt the first explosion before he heard it. The ground beneath his boots shook as the Eastern Guard Tower simply vanished in a pillar of flame and twisted metal. His night vision whited out momentarily, and when it cleared, he saw the impossible: pinpoint strikes hitting targets with surgical precision, but no aircraft visible in the sky. "What the hell?" Martinez started to say, then threw himself flat as another explosion lit up the night. A weapons cache erupted in a secondary blast that sent debris raining down hundreds of meters away. Through it all, the sky remained empty, silent except for the distant thunder of destruction. Ghost bird," Prophet whispered into his radio, using the emergency frequency reserved for situations that didn't officially exist. "Unknown friendly, identify yourself." Nothing. Just the continued whisper of death falling from the darkness above. Inside the compound, panic spread like wildfire. Shouted Arabic commands echoed off concrete walls as fighters scrambled to man their remaining defenses. Searchlights swept frantically across the sky, finding nothing but stars and darkness. Their sophisticated radar systems showed clear airspace, yet their positions were being eliminated with textbook precision. The hostages in the basement heard the explosions and felt hope flicker in their chests for the first time in days. Staff Sergeant Tommy Bulldog Chen, his face swollen from interrogation, managed a smile through split lips. "Air support," he whispered to his men. "Finally." But Corporal Jake Nomad Reeves, the team's communications specialist, shook his head slowly. "No," he said, listening to the distinctive pattern of the strikes. "This isn't air support. This is something else." He'd spent 6 years coordinating close air support missions. He knew the sound of every aircraft in the American inventory. This wasn't any of them. Above, Nix was painting her masterpiece in fire and precision. Each strike was calculated not just for tactical advantage, but to minimize civilian casualties in the surrounding area. Her targeting system had identified 3 possible civilian shelters within the blast radius, and she adjusted her attack pattern accordingly. This wasn't just about destroying the enemy. It was about proving that American forces could operate with a level of precision that bordered on the supernatural. The compound's communications center disappeared in a flash of white light. The motor pool followed seconds later, taking with it any chance of enemy reinforcement or escape. Guard positions were eliminated with such speed and accuracy that surviving fighters began to believe they were under attack by an entire squadron. "Allahu Akbar," Someone screamed into the night, but his voice was swallowed by another explosion as the last SAM site was reduced to smoking rubble. In less than 5 minutes, a fortified position that had taken weeks to prepare was reduced to isolated pockets of confused, terrified fighters. Prophet watched the systematic destruction with professional appreciation and growing wonder. Whoever was up there wasn't just skilled, they were artistic in their application of violence. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the explosions had been. Alpha Team lay pressed against the desert floor, scanning the sky through their night vision, seeing nothing but empty darkness. The compound before them was now a Swiss cheese of craters and burning debris, its defensive positions neutralized with surgical precision. "Movement," whispered Martinez, his rifle trained on the main building. Figures were emerging from the smoke, not fighters but men in American uniforms, supporting wounded comrades as they stumbled into the night. "Bravo Team! Alive!" Prophet felt his throat tighten as he recognized Chen's distinctive silhouette even at this distance. The man was limping badly but moving under his own power, helping to carry another operative who appeared unconscious. 7 men had gone in. 7 men were coming out. The impossible had become reality in the span of a single, devastating airstrike. "Alpha 1 to all stations," Prophet whispered into his radio, his voice cracking slightly. "We have eyes on Bravo Team. All 7 souls accounted for. Repeat, all 7 souls accounted for." Still no response from command, but somehow that didn't matter anymore. They had their people back. Above them, invisible and silent, Nix Castellanos allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction. Her fuel gauge showed yellow, enough to get home, but not enough for a second engagement. Her weapons bays were empty except for her cannon, but 20mm rounds wouldn't be needed tonight. The compound below was finished as a fighting force. Through her targeting camera, she watched Alpha Team move to link up with the rescued hostages. Professional soldiers reuniting with their brothers, alive against all odds because one pilot had decided that sometimes the right mission isn't the authorized mission. Sometimes the right war isn't the declared war. Her radio crackled suddenly, startling her. Unknown aircraft, this is Reaper Base. Identify yourself immediately." Command had finally noticed her absence from her assigned patrol route. In approximately 90 minutes, she would face a court-martial that could end her career and send her to military prison. But right now, 14 American soldiers were walking away from what should have been their grave. Right now, families back home would get phone calls telling them their sons and husbands were coming home. Right now, none of the consequences waiting for her seemed to matter very much at all. She banked the Raptor toward home, leaving behind a legend that would be whispered in ready rooms and barracks for decades to come. The debriefing room at FOB Gibraltar buzzed with tension as Alpha and Bravo teams sat around a scarred metal table, their gear still smelling of cordite and desert dust. Commander Morrison paced behind them, his face a mask of confusion and barely controlled anger. The official report made no sense. The timeline made no sense. The tactical assessment made no sense. "Let me understand this correctly," Morrison said, stopping behind Prophet's chair. "You infiltrated a heavily fortified compound, engaged multiple hostiles, extracted 7 POWs and suffered 0 casualties, all in under 20 minutes. He paused, letting the impossibility of it sink in. "With no air support." Chen, his left eye swollen shut and his jaw wired from torture, managed to speak through gritted teeth. "Sir, there was air support, precision strikes, sequential target elimination. Whoever was up there knew exactly what they were doing." Morrison's face reddened. "Staff Sergeant, I'm looking at air traffic control data from 3 different sources. The sky was empty." Nomad leaned forward, his communications background making him the de facto technical expert. "Sir, with respect, that's impossible. I counted at least 12 separate strikes, all delivered from altitude, all hitting within meters of their intended targets. That level of precision requires advanced targeting systems and guided munitions. Morrison slammed his hand on the table. There were no authorized aircraft in that airspace. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of helicopters landing outside. These men had spent their careers trusting the chain of command, following orders without question. But they had also learned to trust their eyes, their ears, and their instincts. What they had witnessed didn't match any official explanation. Prophet spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, maybe the aircraft wasn't authorized. Maybe someone decided that getting our people home was more important than following protocol." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you suggesting that an American pilot deliberately disobeyed direct orders and conducted an unauthorized combat mission in Syrian airspace?" Prophet met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I'm suggesting that whoever was up there saved 14 American lives. Maybe that's what matters." Morrison turned away, staring at the wall of tactical maps and communication equipment. He'd been a SEAL himself once, before politics and rank pulled him away from the sharp end of the spear. He understood the bonds these men shared, the unwritten code that said you never left anyone behind. But he also understood the complexity of modern warfare, the diplomatic nightmares that unauthorized actions could create. The truth was, he'd already received 3 phone calls from Langley, 2 from the Pentagon, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize but instinctively knew he should answer. Someone very high up the food chain was extremely interested in the events of the previous night. 3 time zones away, Captain Nix Castellano sat in a sterile interrogation room at Incirlik Air Base, her flight suit replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit that marked her as a prisoner rather than an officer. Across from her, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hammer Davidson reviewed a thick file with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a case. "Unauthorized deviation from flight plan," Davidson read aloud. "Unauthorized entry into hostile airspace, unauthorized weapons deployment, violation of rules of engagement, destruction of foreign assets without proper authorization." She looked up, her eyes cold as winter steel. "Captain, do you understand that any one of these charges could end your career and result in significant prison time?" Nix sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face showing no emotion. She had known this moment would come from the instant she'd made the decision to divert from her reconnaissance mission. Military justice was swift and unforgiving, especially when it came to actions that could create international incidents. "I understand the charges, ma'am," she replied quietly. Her voice carried no trace of defiance or regret, just the calm acceptance of a professional who had weighed the consequences before acting. Davidson leaned forward, studying Nix's face for any crack in her composure. 14 men are alive because of your actions, Captain. I want you to know that before we proceed. But 14 men being alive doesn't erase the fact that you violated every protocol we have for a reason." Nix nodded slowly. "I understand that too, ma'am." The interrogation room fell silent except for the soft hum of recording equipment and air conditioning. Outside, F-22 Raptors continued their routine patrols, their pilots blissfully unaware that one of their own was facing the end of everything she'd worked for since graduating from the Air Force Academy 15 years earlier. But in a basement in Syria, 7 men had gone to sleep in their own beds instead of facing execution at dawn. And sometimes, that mathematics was more important than regulations. Davidson closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "Tell me about your father, Captain." The question came from nowhere, catching Nix off guard for the first time since the interrogation had begun. Her composed mask flickered slightly as memories surfaced unbidden. Colonel Marcus Phantom Castellanos had been a legend in his own right, a Vietnam-era fighter pilot who had flown 127 combat missions in an F-4 Phantom II, earning 2 distinguished flying crosses and a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home against impossible odds. My father was a pilot, ma'am. He taught me that sometimes doing the right thing and following orders aren't the same thing. The words slipped out before she could stop them, a rare moment of vulnerability in an otherwise professional facade. Davidson nodded slowly, making a note in her file. He was shot down over Laos in 1971, wasn't he? Spent 3 months evading capture, helped coordinate the rescue of 2 other downed airmen. Nix's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, ma'am. He never talked about it much. Davidson smiled for the first time since entering the room. That's because the mission was classified. Still is officially. The implication hung in the air between them. Marcus Castellanos had also violated protocols, had also operated without authorization in hostile territory. The difference was that his actions had been quietly approved after the fact. His violations transformed into commendations through the alchemy of successful results and political convenience. Your father's actions in Laos saved 8 American lives, Davidson continued. The operation was later incorporated into official doctrine for combat search and rescue. Sometimes, Captain, the military learns more from successful rule-breaking than from perfect rule-following. Nix remained silent, unsure where this conversation was leading, but sensing that her fate was being decided by forces beyond her understanding. Davidson stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the flight line where rows of fighter aircraft sat ready for whatever missions the day might bring. The problem with your situation, Captain, is that officially, your mission never happened. The strikes never occurred. The hostages were rescued by ground forces alone. The Syrian compound was destroyed by an accidental explosion in their own weapons cache. Nix felt a chill run down her spine. Ma'am, Davidson turned back to face her, her expression unreadable. Officially, you never deviated from your reconnaissance flight. You never entered Syrian airspace. You never fired a shot in anger. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Officially, last night never happened. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, pregnant with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. Nix understood now why the interrogation had felt different from what she'd expected. This wasn't about punishment. This was about something else entirely. Outside the interrogation room, decisions were being made at levels far above a captain's pay grade. Phone calls were being placed to offices in Washington, where men and women in expensive suits weighed the cost of international incidents against the value of operational deniability. Files were being sealed, reports were being redacted, and the official record was being carefully sculpted to reflect a version of events that everyone could live with. But in ready rooms and barracks across the world, a different story was already taking root. A story about a lone pilot who had appeared from nowhere to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. A story that would grow in the telling, becoming legend faster than the truth could catch up. The men of Alpha and Bravo teams were not in the habit of keeping secrets from each other, but they were in the habit of protecting their own. By nightfall, every special operations unit in the region would know about the ghost bird who had saved their brothers. By the end of the week, the story would reach every forward operating base from Afghanistan to Africa. Davidson returned to her seat and opened a different file, this one marked with classifications so high that Nix couldn't even see the designation. Captain, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Are you interested in flying missions that officially don't exist, for a unit that officially doesn't exist, in support of operations that will never appear in any history book? Nix's heart skipped a beat as the pieces began falling into place. This wasn't a court-martial. This was a recruitment interview. The violation of protocols hadn't ended her career. It had proven her qualification for something that existed in the shadows between official policy and operational necessity. Ma'am, I enlisted to serve my country and protect American lives. If you're asking whether I'm willing to continue doing that regardless of whether anyone knows about it, the answer is yes. Davidson smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. I thought you might say that. The file contained orders transferring Captain Nix Castellanos to a unit designated only by a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to anyone without the appropriate clearance. Her new assignment would take her to places that didn't appear on maps, to fly aircraft that didn't appear in official inventories, in support of missions that would be remembered only by the people whose lives depended on their success. But first, there was one more conversation she needed to have. The encrypted communication link connected her to FOB Gibraltar, where Commander Morrison sat alone in his office, staring at 14 personnel files spread across his desk. Each file represented a man who should have been dead, whose families should have been receiving folded flags instead of phone calls promising a safe return home. Commander Morrison, this is Valkyrie. The voice came through his secure radio with crystal clarity, though officially no such call sign existed in any database he could access. Morrison leaned forward, his exhaustion temporarily forgotten. Valkyrie, this is Reaper Base. I've been hopping to hear from you. The conversation that followed would never be recorded, never be transcribed, and never be officially acknowledged. But it established a connection that would prove crucial in the months and years to come, when other impossible situations would require impossible solutions, when other American lives would hang in the balance of a single pilot's willingness to break every rule that mattered. Commander, I want you to know that your men performed exceptionally under fire. They're a credit to their training and to the uniform they wear. Morrison felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. These weren't the words of a rogue pilot. These were the words of a professional who understood the weight of command, the burden of responsibility for the lives of others. Valkyrie, I don't know who you are or what unit you're with, but I need you to know that 14 families are going to sleep better tonight because of your actions. That matters more than any regulation or protocol. The radio was silent for a long moment before her reply came through. Roger that, Reaper. And Commander, if you ever need the sky to not be empty again, you know how to reach me. The channel went dead, leaving Morrison alone with his files and his thoughts. He would spend the rest of his career wondering about the pilot who had appeared from nowhere to save his men, wondering if she was still out there somewhere, watching over other operations that seemed hopeless. The truth was that she was still out there, but she was no longer alone. The success of the Syrian operation had proven a concept that military planners had been developing in classified briefings for months. The idea that certain missions required pilots who were willing to operate outside normal command structures, who could make split-second decisions without waiting for authorization from higher headquarters. Within 6 months, there would be 12 pilots in the program. Within a year, there would be 30. They would operate from bases that didn't officially exist, flying aircraft that were officially still in development, supporting operations that would never be acknowledged by any government. They would be known only by their call signs and their results, ghosts in the machine of modern warfare. But it had all started with one pilot's decision that saving lives mattered more than saving her career. It had started with Nix Castellanos, and a lonely F-22 Raptor hanging invisible in the Syrian night sky, waiting for the right moment to redefine what air support really meant. The legend of the ghost bird was just beginning. 2 years later, the story had evolved into something approaching mythology. In special operations communities around the world, veterans would gather around tables laden with beer and war stories, and someone would inevitably mention the night the sky rained precision death on a Syrian compound. The details varied with each telling. Sometimes it was an entire squadron of invisible aircraft. Sometimes it was a single pilot with supernatural accuracy. But Alpha Team's prophet Vega always corrected the embellishments when he heard them. He was a staff sergeant now, his promotion accelerated by the successful completion of one of the most difficult extractions in SEAL history. When younger operators would ask him about that night, He would set down his drink and speak with the careful precision of a man who had witnessed something that defied easy explanation. It wasn't supernatural, he would say, his weathered face serious in the dim light of whatever bar they'd found themselves in. It was just the most professional piece of flying I've ever seen. Surgical doesn't begin to describe it. Whoever was up there turned a tactical nightmare into a textbook operation in under 5 minutes. The younger SEALs would lean forward, hungry for details about legendary operations that weren't included in any training manual. Prophet would describe the sound of the strikes, the precision of the targeting, the impossible accuracy of munitions delivered from an aircraft that never appeared on radar. He would talk about the silence that followed, more profound than the explosions that had preceded it. And he would always end with the same observation. In our business, we talk about guardian angels. That night, we met one. The story had legs because it touched something fundamental in the military psyche. The belief that when everything went wrong, when the mission seemed impossible and the odds were insurmountable, someone would appear from nowhere to tip the scales. It was a story about competence and courage, about professionals who excelled at their craft and were willing to risk everything for their brothers in arms. But for the men who had lived it, who had felt the ground shake beneath their feet and watched precision death fall from empty skis, it was more than a story. It was proof that the bonds forged in combat transcended rank and regulation, that somewhere in the vast machinery of modern warfare, there were still individuals willing to put mission accomplishment and troop welfare ahead of career preservation. Chen, now fully recovered from his injuries and back to leading men in harm's way, had his own version of the story. He would describe the moment in the compound's basement when the first explosion had shaken dust from the ceiling, when hope had flickered in the eyes of men who had prepared themselves to die. "We knew someone was coming for us," he would say, "but we didn't know they were already there, waiting above us like some kind of avenging angel." The psychological impact of the rescue had been profound. For men trained to expect the worst, to prepare for abandonment and death in hostile territory, the knowledge that someone had risked everything to bring them home had reaffirmed their faith in the brotherhood of arms. They had returned to duty with renewed confidence, knowing that even in the darkest moments, they were not alone. Nomad had leveraged his communications expertise into a position with Joint Special Operations Command, where he now coordinated air support for high-risk missions across multiple theaters. He had access to classified databases that detailed every aircraft in the American inventory, every pilot qualified for combat operations, every mission flown in support of special operations. But he had never found any record of the F-22 that had appeared over Syria that night. Ghost protocols, he would explain to the few people with sufficient clearance to hear such things. Some missions are so sensitive that they're compartmentalized beyond normal classification levels. The pilots exist, the aircraft exist, but the operations they conduct are designed to be untraceable. It was as close to an official explanation as anyone was likely to get. The truth, as Nomad suspected but could never prove, was that the Syrian operation had been the proof of concept for an entirely new approach to special operations support. The success of that single mission had led to the development of protocols that allowed for real-time intervention without traditional command authorization, for pilots who could make tactical decisions based on ground conditions rather than distant strategic considerations. The pilots selected for such missions underwent psychological evaluations that bordered on the surreal. They needed to be competent enough to operate independently in hostile airspace, confident enough to make life-and-death decisions without backup, and stable enough to live with the consequences of actions that could never be officially acknowledged. Most importantly, they needed to be willing to sacrifice personal recognition for mission success. Colonel Davidson, now working directly for the Secretary of Defense on matters too sensitive for normal channels, had overseen the expansion of what was internally known as the Valkyrie program. The name had emerged organically from the success of that first mission, and it had stuck despite protests from officers who felt it was too theatrical for serious military planning. Names have power, Davidson would argue in classified briefings attended by generals and cabinet members. Call signs create identity, and identity drives performance. These pilots aren't just delivering ordnance, they're delivering hope to ground forces who have exhausted all other options. The program had been funded through budget lines so obscure that even congressional oversight committees couldn't track them. But success brought its own problems. As word of the program's capabilities spread through classified channels, demand for Valkyrie support began to outstrip availability. Mission requests flooded in from theater commanders around the world, each convinced that their particular operation was critical enough to warrant intervention by pilots who officially didn't exist. The selection criteria became increasingly stringent as the program expanded. Candidates needed at least 1,000 hours of combat flight time, flawless records of tactical decision-making under pressure, and psychological profiles that indicated unusual independence combined with absolute reliability. Most importantly, they needed to demonstrate the kind of professional competence that could turn impossible odds into successful outcomes. Of the first 100 pilots evaluated for the program, only 12 had been selected. Of those 12, only 8 had successfully completed the advanced training program that prepared them for operations that existed outside normal command structures. And of those 8, only 3 had demonstrated the kind of instinctive tactical brilliance that characterized truly exceptional military aviators. Captain Nix, Valkyrie, Castellanos remained the gold standard against which all other candidates were measured. Her reputation within the program had grown to almost mythical proportions. She had flown 43 classified missions across 7 different countries, supporting operations ranging from hostage rescue to precision elimination of high-value targets. Her mission success rate was perfect. Her ability to minimize collateral damage was unmatched, and her willingness to accept personal risk in support of ground forces had become legendary among the small community of people cleared to know such things. But Nix herself remained remarkably unchanged by the attention. She flew her missions with the same methodical professionalism that had characterized her regular Air Force service, approached each target with the same careful analysis that had made her one of the most technically competent pilots of her generation, and returned from each operation with the same quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Her quarters at the classified facility where Valkyrie program pilots were based reflected her personality, neat, functional, and decorated only with a single photograph of her father standing beside an F-4 Phantom II in Vietnam. She had added no mementos of her own missions, collected no souvenirs from the countries where she had operated, and maintained no record of the lives she had saved or the enemies she had eliminated. "The mission is the memory," she would tell younger pilots when they asked her about the psychological challenges of operating in the shadows. "Every successful operation validates the program, proves that we can make a difference in situations that seemed hopeless. That's enough recognition for me." Her humility was genuine, but it masked a fierce pride in the work she was doing and an absolute commitment to the men and women who depended on her skills. The Valkyrie program had evolved far beyond its original conception, but it remained true to the principles that had been established that night over Syria. When conventional options were exhausted, when ground forces faced overwhelming odds, when the political costs of official intervention were too high to accept, there were pilots prepared to appear from nowhere and tip the balance. They operated in the space between policy and necessity, between authorization and obligation. But for all the success of the program, for all the lives it had saved and operations it had rescued, Nick still remembered that first mission with unusual clarity. It had been the moment when her career had taken a turn she never could have anticipated, when her commitment to serving others had led her into a world that existed parallel to, but separate from the military she had originally joined. The Syrian operation remained her touchstone, the standard against which she measured every subsequent mission. 7 men had been scheduled to die at dawn. 14 men had been walking into a carefully prepared trap, and one pilot's decision to break every rule that mattered had changed the outcome completely. It was proof that individual competence, properly applied at the critical moment, could alter the course of events in ways that vast bureaucracies could never achieve. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded her, Nix would lie in her bunk and think about Prophet Vega and his team, wondering where they were and what missions they were conducting. She would think about Chen and the other rescued hostages, hoping they had found their way back to the families who had almost lost them forever. And she would think about her father, wondering if he would be proud of the path his daughter's career had taken. The answer, she knew, was written in the stars above every battlefield where American forces operated. Somewhere in the darkness, watching over operations that seemed hopeless, were pilots prepared to do whatever was necessary to bring their people home. The sky was never really empty because the Valkyries were always watching. And in ready rooms and barracks around the world, the story continued to grow. New details were added with each telling, new examples of impossible precision and supernatural timing. The legend had taken on a life of its own, inspiring confidence in ground forces who knew that even when conventional support was unavailable, someone was still watching over them from the darkness above. But legends, Nix had learned, were just stories people told to make sense of competence. And competence, properly applied with courage and commitment, was indistinguishable from magic to those whose lives depended on its timely application. The ghost bird had become a symbol of something larger than any individual mission or pilot, a representation of the military's commitment to leaving no one behind, regardless of the personal or professional costs involved. The program continued to expand, its missions grew more complex, and its pilots became increasingly skilled at operating in the shadows between official policy and operational necessity. But it had all begun with one woman's decision that doing the right thing mattered more than following the rules, and that sometimes the most important missions were the ones that officially never happened at all. In the end, that was the true legacy of the ghost bird, proof that individuals could still make a difference in an increasingly complex world, that competence and courage remained the most powerful weapons in any arsenal, and that the sky was never empty as long as someone was willing to claim it in defense of those who needed protection most. The legend lived on, growing stronger with each mission, each rescue, each impossible situation transformed into successful reality by pilots whose names would never appear in history books, but whose actions would echo through military lore for generations to come. They were the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back to the first military aviator who had ever risked his life to protect ground forces, the latest chapter in a story that would continue as long as there were pilots brave enough to fly into danger and skilled enough to emerge victorious. The seals had been right. The sky was never empty. It was filled with guardians whose presence was felt most keenly when it seemed most absent, whose protection was most valuable.